the BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. And here's round one to test their vocabulary. 2 marks if they get the meanings of the following words approximately right. Beginning with you, Nancy Spain. What is dressage?
This is a term in horse, as they call it, riding, when you teach the horse to change its feet on the diagonals of the canter. It's a very complicated form of tuition in horse maneuver, and frightfully difficult.
You're dead right. It's the training of horses in obedience and deportment. Thank you. What is a barcarolle?
It's a bit of music that goes... Na, 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 na.
But who apart from you, Frank, is singing?
It's the Tales of Hoffmann by Offenbach. So it's a chorale by Offenbach, a Barcarolle.
No, I want to... That's a particular instance. What I want to know is what it is in a generic sense.
Is that rude?
No.
You sing it on a bark.
It's what particular kind of bark?
Gondola. Thank you.
Jolly good.
Dilys, well done.
Again.
Dilys, it's a gondola song.
That's it.
Sung on a...
Yes, you...
Gondola, I would hazard.
You fought your way home. It's the song of a Venetian gondolier, or an imitation of that, or it can be the gondolier himself, singing or not. Denis Powell. What is a proponent? Proponent.
Something which proposes.
Something.
Someone.
Right, that's good enough. A person who proposes something puts forward a motion or a theory, and like propound. 2 marks, well done. Denis Norden, I think this is a bit tougher. What is windage? W-I-N-D-A-G-E. Windage.
That's too much to hope that it's the amount of wind at a particular place at any given moment.
You're right about that, but it's a rather peculiar type of
I tell you,
wind.
there's a very famous painting called Windage. The full title is When Did You Last See Your Father? It would be fair to say that I'm a little unclear.
In itself, it's highly technical. It's the difference between the diameter of the bore of a gun and the bullet or projectile, which allows for the escape of the gas, the wind being the gas or something like that. But it's also the allowance that you make for the wind in deflecting what you're firing. So I give you half a mark for getting that bit of it. Well, before we start round 2, I give each team a quotation for them to write down, and I want the 2 women members of the team to study those quotations, and at the end I shall ask them where the quotations come from. Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, your quotation is, take a pair of sparkling eyes, and Dilys Powell with Frank, yours is, it was roses, roses all the way. And then at the end of the programme I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their idea of how these words came to be said or written, and I don't want any of these answers yet. So round 2, which is a reason why. 3 marks if you can give me the reason for the following occurrence in literature or drama, and I might give a few marks for originality if you don't in fact know. Nancy Spain, why did Don Quixote tilt at windmills?
Well, he was very short-sighted, and he thought that they were a mad army amassing on the plain. And so, all alone with this one horse called Rosinante and this one lance called Sancho Panza, he went dashing at these windmills.
What happened?
Well, he got caught up on the mill of the wind, in the windage, as you might say,
yes.
And he went round and round on this windmill.
Well, it's a very graphic account, and it's exactly what happened. I'll give you 3 marks. Don Quixote, suffering from delusions, thought that the windmills were giants, and as Nancy quite rightly says, he got caught up in the sails, and both horse and he got carried round and round and round in a most uncomfortable way. Frank Muir, in Fielding's novel Tom Jones, why is Tom himself first adopted by Mr. Allworthy and later thrown out by him?
Tom Jones was found as a day-old chick or babe on Squire Allworthy's bed.
Yes?
Squire Allworthy, after probing, thought that the father was Partridge the schoolmaster, I believe, and the mother was a maid.
Mm-hmm.
So he adopted the child from the goodness of his heart and brought him up with his own son, Blifil. Blifil, who was a sort of caddish one, then grew up and was Squire Allworthy, tried to get Blifil married to Squire Weston's daughter, Sophia, the beautiful, incomparable Sophia. Meanwhile, back at the old farmhouse, Tom Jones had been living it up a bit with Moll Seagram, the gamekeeper's daughter. And Tom Jones was found in rather embarrassing circumstances by Square and Thwackum, his tutors, with Moll Seagram. The squire was very incensed and sent him packing. And you're only about an eighth of the way through then.
3 full marks. I can't think why Fielding took the trouble to write the novel. It's all there in what Frank has told you. All right, Dilys Powell. In the novel Jane Eyre, why was Jane able, in the end, to marry her Mr. Rochester?
Well, because poor Mr. Rochester's wife had somehow passed out of this world. I think there'd been a fire.
Yes.
There'd been a fire. She'd been burnt. And poor Mr. Rochester trying, as any good husband should, to rescue his wife, who I may say was completely bats.
Yeah.
As every good wife
got himself rather sort of burnt up, and was blind and pretty helpless.
Yes.
And Jane came back and said, well, thank heaven, I can look after my beloved one.
Yes, again, a very good summary of a very great novel. The wife, who was, as Dilys says, a lunatic, didn't in fact get burnt alive. She jumped off the roof when Mr. Rochester was trying to save her. He was blinded, he lost a hand. He sent a sort of message in telepathic fashion to Jane, because she was just about to marry the Reverend St. John Rivers, which had been a disaster, and in the end she married Mr. Rochester. 3 months.
You don't know it would have been a disaster.
Jack's a romantic type.
Yeah.
Denis Norden. In Tennyson's Idylls of the King, why did Queen Guinevere hie herself to a nunnery, eventually become an abbess, and shortly afterwards die in the nunnery?
Well, she had this rather wild, splendid thing with Sir Lancelot.
Yes.
And got very browned off. I can't remember why. I think it must be something to do with all that armour. But that's the bone. I don't intend to dilate on this, as has been the precedent in the past. I think that's an adequate answer for the question, quite frankly.
You make it difficult for me, Denis. I'm going to give you 2 out of 3. The point was that there was a very nasty character called Modred who sneaked to King Arthur about this long-drawn-out affair between Sir Lancelot and Guinevere, and she ran away to a nunnery, and King Arthur arrived there, denounced her, but then forgave her and left her forever. Well, the next round is origins and derivations, and I have to sort of try to mark this according to my discretion with a maximum of 3 marks. I want to know what these phrases mean and what the origin was. Anti-Spain, not a phrase that I should associate with you in the least. Mealy-Mouthed.
Well, it means somebody who minces their words and puts in better words than the evil ones that had occurred to them in the first place. And I suppose that it derived from some pastime or something of that sort, where these people were all swearing, and to punish them they pushed their heads into a bin full of meal.
It isn't quite right. It does mean smooth of speech or smarmy or hypocritical, and it's got 2 possible derivations, either from the Greek Mealy-Mouthed, meaning honey speech, or it means pale, mealy, powdery sort of speech, as opposed to really sort of vivid and, as you say, vicious speech. 2 out of 3. Frank Muir. Etiquette.
Etiquette.
Mm-hmm.
The present-day meaning, sort of the exact the dictionary definition, is it's stuff which, if you don't do, you're common. It's sort of protocol and that sort of behaviour.
Yes.
You know, with which hand you hold the knife to convey the peas to the mouth. It comes, the derivation, it comes, of course, from French.
Yeah. And
Etiquette.
It meant?
From the French, ticket, ticket.
Yes.
Yes, label.
Absolutely right.
Yes.
Well-mannered behaviour, or the unwritten code which restricts professional men in their profession, but it does, in fact, come from a word meaning ticket, and it was a custom at the French court to issue a card or ticket giving details of the kind of procedure which you had to follow if you were going to be persona grata at court. So it was a real ticket once. Dilys Powell, mad as a hatter.
Mad as a hatter? Well, it means especially mad, doesn't it?
Yes.
Really.
And origin?
Like poor Mrs. Rochester. Origin. There was a very, very mad hatter in the 18th century.
Yes. Well, you're about 1 century wrong.
No, well, 17th century.
What did he do?
Went mad.
Made a lot of hats. Wrong sizes.
He filled a long felt.
2.5 for ingenuity. It means absolutely crackers or crazy, but the original Mad Hatter was not the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland, but Robert Crabbe, who lived in Chesham in the 17th century, who was extremely eccentric and in the end showed what was clearly madness, but he gave away all his goods to the poor. And so after that, hatters were supposed to be mad. Rather unkind story, I think. Denis Norden, to pay your footing.
Oh, yes. Yeah, well, this is one of the unknown, well-known phrases. What's saying? I never heard it. I suppose it means to pay your share.
Yes?
Footing. Your footing. Well, that means you pay according to how tall you are. You pay up, which is why you'll find that small men are generally richer than tall men. You notice that most rich men are small. It's why Frank and I are skint.
Well, again, I got to give you 2.5 for ingenuity. It means to pay for when your turn comes round, often a round of drinks nowadays. But it was originally what the newcomer into a trade had to pay before he was allowed in, a fixed sum paid over before he put his foot over the door and entered on his new trade. Later on, that was found a bit tiresome, and so he normally, again, would pay for a large round of drinks. Well, the next round is about definitions, and 2 marks if you know of whom or of what the following definitions were written. Extra mark if you can tell me by whom they were written. Nancy Spain. Its one charm is that it makes a life of deception absolutely necessary for both parties.
Marriage, I suppose.
Yes, but by whom?
Somebody with a nice turn of phrase.
Yes.
Dr. Johnson.
No, later.
Sidney Smith.
No, go on a bit later still.
Oscar Wilde.
Yes. Yes, you creep home with your 3 marks. It's Oscar Wilde on marriage in The Picture of Dorian Gray. First chapter. Frank Muir, it is the only sensual pleasure without vice.
Music.
Yes. All right.
It's also the food of love, so
That's how you're
does
wrong.
come. It was Johnson said it.
Yes, quite right.
I was supposed to have said it.
That's even better.
And
3.5 marks. I should
Will I give you 4 if I tell you where it comes from?
I give you 4 if you know where it comes from.
The Swan of Lichfield wrote it in a series of notes she wrote to Boswell when he was compiling the biography.
I think that's true.
You haven't got it there, have you?
It also occurs somewhere else. But I got to give you your 4 marks. I think you've earned that. It's attributed to Dr. Johnson. It comes in Anecdotes by William Seward, and I think Frank's probably right. It's probably also mentioned by the Swan of Lichfield, so 4 marks you get. Dilys Powell, why does this magnificent something which saves work and makes life easier bring us so little happiness? The simple answer runs, because we have not yet learned to make sensible use of it. Very great scientist. What was the something?
Machine?
It's very nearly right.
A machine. Device, mechanical?
No, what is behind the machine?
Oh.
Well, factory walls.
Grease.
Behind the machine?
Shop steward, usually. Inventor.
Invention.
2 out of 3. It's Albert Einstein talking about applied science and address at the California Institute of Technology in 1931. Denis Norden, regard their society as a necessary unpleasantness of social life and avoid it as much as possible.
Well, there's so many relations.
They could be, but one particular set. You've got to take
Children.
Divide the line down the middle. Take
Women.
Yes. Who would be likely to have said that, Denis?
Pushkin.
No, I give it 2 out of 3.
Shovin. No?
It's Count Leo.
Tolstoy.
It's about women, and it's by
Tolstoy,
Count
yes.
Leo Tolstoy in his diary. He ought to know better. And now we come to the last round and go back to the quotations I gave to the 2 teams earlier in the program. The 2 marks, Nancy Spain, can you give me the origin of your quotation? Take a pair of sparkling eyes.
Well, it's sung by Nanki Poo in The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan. It goes on about a pair of rosy lips and all that.
Rosy lips, all right, but isn't it the wrong opera? Isn't it the...
Is it? Oh, I see. It's the Gondoliers, yes.
Yes, that's better.
Oh, sorry.
So it can't be sung by Nanki Poo, certainly.
No, indeed
There's
it
only
can't.
one opera.
Well, I don't know any of the names of the people in the Gondoliers.
Never mind. You've got the Gondoliers. It's by Gilbert Sullivan giving some assistance in the Gondoliers, and it goes on, happy man, doesn't it? A lot. 2 marks. Dilys Powell, I'd like the origin of your quotation, which was, it was roses, roses all the way.
It's a poem by Robert Browning.
Do you remember what it's called?
The Patriot.
Quite right. 2 marks. And now I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their explanation of how these quotations came into being, and on this occasion the marks will go to whichever unlikely explanation receives the larger and longer amount of applause from the audience here in the studio. So back to Denis Norden with his quotation, take a pair of sparkling eyes.
Well, this was actually the text of a telegram which was sent to me by the Home Secretary. It started because of a little domestic upset we had at home. You see, we had a whole succession of these au pair girls, and we thought it would be a good idea to spread our net a little bit wider, and we succeeded in getting a girl from a country which none of our neighbours had even nibbled at yet. Lapland. A nice type of girl. Her name was Nanuka, and she was very adaptable and very cheerful and most eager to please. And Nanuka took to the life very well, except one thing distressed her. You see, we have a lot of friends who are Americans. I believe in it. I do. I believe have them to your house. I think we might get America back, but we have these Americans over, and they sit at the table with us. And the thing about Americans is that if you serve them drinks, they must have ice in the drinks, in any drink, which is very strange sometimes. We hear cough mixture clink, But Nanuka used to get very upset about this because we have only a small refrigerator with one of the ice thing in it, only does 16 ice cubes, you see, and then you have to wait about 3 days before it frosts up again. And so that any American friend could have no more than 16 drinks, which, so most of them were practically like signing the pledge. And Nanuka knew about this because she worked out how the refrigerator worked. In fact, some nights when she got homesick, she used to sleep in the refrigerator. But she said to me, it seems so wrong that I come from a country which has so much ice, and yet here you have to go short. And I said, oh, well, you know, something just as memorable, and I left it at that. And came August, and we all went on our holidays. We went on our holidays, and she went back to Lapland for her holidays, and we got a card from her saying, it's absolutely freezing here, and it snowed last night, which wasn't really very original because it was exactly what we'd written to her from Torquay. But at the bottom of the card, she put, I'm bringing you back a present. Now, what that present was the reason for this telegram I was telling you about that I got from the Home Secretary. Our first intimation of it was a phone call we got from the Coast Guards, who said that one of our launches has just intercepted off the north of Scotland a girl who is towing a small iceberg. Well, now, you see, you just can't do it. There are the laws of customs and excise which say you may only bring into the country, I think it works out something like 2 pounds of ice per person, or it can be 25 cigars, you know. And it went on for weeks trying to get out of this with solicitors, and finally, in order to get Nanu out of custody, we had to go to the Home Secretary himself, and he finally granted it, but did send us this telegram telling us to instruct her not to do this again. As I said, the telegram read, take au pair off smuggling ice.
We pass on to Frank Muir, and if you remember, his quotation was, it was roses, roses all the way.
Well, I mean, I should have known it was going to be one of those days. But no, I ignored it. And pardon. It was... It's a lovely day, it really was. The sun was shining. So I jumped into a Green Line bus, lovely ride, and this awfully nice woman, rather superior type, was sitting beside me, and we chatted, and she told me all about her sister Maud, who had to be operated on for the Windage, and then it all got a bit, you know, and I got off the Green Line bus then. I said, excuse me, and just sort of got off where we were. And we were to a very nice little village, actually, very nice. It was on a tributary of the Thames, the River Wye. I'd never heard of it, but there it was. It said, there's a nice little bridge over, and it said, Thames Conservancy, River Wye, tributary. So I thought, hey-ho, sailor boy, why don't you get a dinghy and have a row? The which I did. I paid £1 deposit to a Mr. Poundton, who kept the boats there, and I got in the boat, and he showed me how you put the oars in those sort of wishbone things on either side. And I gave about 3 pulls and had a rest, you know. I thought, better not overdo it, Cecil. I actually call myself Cess, although my full name's Cecil. When I'm talking to myself, I say Cess. 2 or 3 years ago, I abbreviated myself. And I decided to go for a little row up the river, and suddenly I was hailed, hey, just like that. And there were 2 policemen, you see, on the banks of the Wye. And one had a whole lot of rope, a lot of hooks on it. They said, could you row one of us across? Because we've got to drag the river, you see, because we've got to bring something up, find something that's dropped in. And they had an idea, and they said, look, if we tie the end of the rope to your end of your dinghy, you could row the other end while we hold our end. I said, I can't row, you know, I'm no nautical man. So they said, oh, please, come on, Cess, because I unfortunately told them my name. And, come on, Cess, give us a hand. So I said, all right, but, you know, I'm not very good at it. Oh, it was awful. I was dropping, absolutely dropping. And darkness was falling, darkness. And just as we finished, the hook suddenly caught in something, and I was pulled up short. And they pulled up a sort of kit bag thing, sort of mail bag, all dripping wet it was. They got very excited and opened it. It was full of all wet £5 notes it was. And you know, the newspapers came out with a story. You know what they said? They talked a whole lot about these constables and how these clever constables had searched, had dragged the River Wye and had found £125,000 in fivers. And they said they were aided. They were aided by an unknown rower. And they said this was an exciting half hour for the unknown rower. Oh, I nearly sobbed at the injustice of it. It wasn't exciting, and it wasn't a half hour. It was process, all the while.
Well, I think by your vote, Frank Muir wins, and we'll buy him a motorboat next time. And that brings us to a final score in which Frank Muir and Dilys Powell win by 1.5 marks from Denis Norden and Nancy Spain, and it also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The programme was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden and Frank Muir, and round one is an attempt to test their vocabularies. 2 marks if they get the meanings of these words more or less right. Beginning with Dilys Powell. The meaning of the word burke, B-U-R-K-E, and it's a verb.
It's a verb? Now you to do with burke and hare?
Yes.
Oh, well, in that case it meant to get a body and sell it.
You have to get the body first.
Yes, well, I mean, in certain cases you got the body by violent means. In fact, I think you strangled it.
That's all right, that'll do. 2 marks. It originally meant to murder by smothering because these nasty characters, Burke and Hare, when they ran out of corpses at the anatomy schools, used to provide the corpses by smothering them first. Since then, it's meant smothering or covering up a story or a rumour, burking the issue, for instance. 2 marks. Denis Norden. What is a detinue? D-E-T-I-N-U-E, like sort of retinue with a D.
I see, yes. Detinue. Detinue. Yes, if you swallow a pawnbroker's ticket, you have a detinue. The only other suggestion is that it is actually a misprint for retinue.
What action would the pawnbroker take?
What action would the pawnbroker take?
If you swallowed it,
If
we'll
you
give you a
swallowed
taste of castor oil.
I think I've got to stop with that one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was trying to help. No, it's an action of detenue is a legal action or legal suit for recovering goods or chattels that you've wrongfully detained. You see, we're getting quite warm on this one, Dennis. I was trying to put you in the position of pawnbroker.
But not recovering it with castor oil.
If we're not recovering with castor oil, but by process of law.
Yeah.
Nancy Spain, what is a hecatomb?
What, dear?
A hecatomb.
Hecatomb?
Tomb. Hecatomb. Hecatomb.
Oh, a hecatomb.
That's it.
Well, it would be a six-sided tomb, wouldn't it?
I haven't seen many of them.
Yes.
Crazy mixed up.
You don't think it would?
No, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, well.
No,
Pity.
it's a great public sacrifice. Originally a sacrifice of 100 oxen, and so a sacrifice that costs lots and lots of victims. Frank Muir, the meaning of the word xylophagus, Xylophagus, xylophagus.
Fugus means eating.
Yes?
Xylophone eater.
Well, that would be a particular example of it.
Oh, yes. Yeah, the common furniture beetle.
Yes, absolutely right.
Xylophagus.
It's something that lives from eating wood, usually insects, though perhaps chaps do it sometimes. 2 marks. Well done. Well, before we start round 2, I give each team a quotation for them to write down, and then I want the 2 women members of the team to study that quotation and at the end to tell me where the quotations come from. And Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, your quotation is, "In the shade of the old apple tree," and Dilys Powell and Frank, yours is, "If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise." And then, at the end of the program, I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their ideas of how these words came to be said or to be written, and I don't want any of these answers yet. So round 2, which is the who, why, and what department, for 2 marks, Dilys Powell, where did John Bunyan write Pilgrim's Progress?
In jail.
Quite right. 2 marks you get. He was in prison twice, I think, or perhaps even more. 12 years the first time, and then for a short time, and he wrote Pilgrim's Progress Part 1 in prison. Denis Norden, who wrote The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, he's usually called, I think. Oh, Munchausen.
Munchausen. A German.
Yes.
Which one? You want me to actually get down to which particular German?
That's what I'd like you to do.
That I am loath to do, because I don't know.
I think it's jolly difficult. It was a chap called Rudolf Rasper, who wrote about a baron who did in fact exist and who told some very tall stories, but in the book they were even taller. Sorry, I can't give any marks. Nancy Spain, perhaps the most famous fables ever written were created by Aesop. What was he?
Aesop was a slave.
Yes? And sort of roughly in which sector of the map?
Oh, Greek.
He was a Phrygian slave, but freed in the end by his master, who was a Thracian Greek. 2 marks. Frank Muir, what was the name of the boy who stood on the burning deck?
Was it Boy Browning?
That was John Mills. Yes.
Casabianca.
Casabianca it was. Giacomo Iocanti Casabianca, whose father commanded the French battleship, the Orient, in the Battle of the Nile against Lord Nelson, and when he found he was losing, he blew up his ship rather than fall into the hands of the English, and the unfortunate boy stood at attention on the deck and got burnt or went down with the ship, or both or either. 2 marks. Well, the next round, I give each member of each team a quotation and ask them for the following line or lines. 2 marks if they can complete the quotation, and 2 more for correctly naming its source. Beginning with Dilys Powell. The grizzly bear is huge and wild. He has devoured the infant child.
It's Hilaire
Yes.
Belloc.
Well, it ought to be, and it isn't.
It isn't?
No. It's a very surprising author.
Longfellow.
I'm sorry, I can't
No,
give
I
any
don't
marks.
know.
It
I
is, in
fixed
fact,
idea.
A. Houseman, who also wrote The Shropshire Lad. He wrote this thing called Infant Innocence. The grizzly bear is huge and wild. He has devoured the infant child. The infant child is not aware he has been eaten by the bear.
Well, you see, because he was a vegetable, that was it, you see. He didn't know.
What a rotten poem.
Denis Norden, to complete this quotation, for this relief, much thanks.
Not all of it.
We're in, yeah. It's right at the beginning of Hamlet.
Yes?
At the very beginning. Who's there? Nay, answer me. Stand and unfold yourself. Long live the king. Bernardo, he. Because he always says, he never says him, he says he. Bernardo, he. For this relief, much thanks. It is bitter cold, and I am sick at heart.
Well done.
Somebody says, long live the king.
Again.
And then Hamlet nips on and says, friends to this ground.
Well, Dennis, I wish I could give you more than 4. That was brilliant. That's the whole of the start of Hamlet, including the right bit. For this relief, much thanks. 'Tis bitter cold, and I am sick at heart. And it's Francisco saying it to Bernardo when the latter relieves him from his sentry post on the battlements at Elsinore. Nancy Spain. My heart's in the highlands, my heart is not here. My heart's in the highlands, a chasing the deer.
Chasing the wild deer and following the roe, my heart's in the highlands wherever I
Quite
go.
right. Well done. And by whom?
Oh, well, now.
2 Scottish authors. Pick one of them.
Eloise
Burns and Scott.
Yes. At 4 marks, Nancy.
It's my
It's
friend.
Burns. It is, in fact, an old traditional song, the first bit of it, but Burns added a lot of extra verses, and it was then quoted by Scott in Waverley, but Burns gets the credit title, I think. Frank Muir.
Do your worst.
Frank Muir. Ring out old shapes of foul disease, ring out the narrowing lust of gold.
It comes from The Ringer by Edgar Wallace. It ends up ring out the old, ring in the new.
That's it.
It's bound to, isn't it?
Yes.
It's by Henry Wadsworth Wilcox.
Not even blanketing the right
Tennyson.
target.
What?
Yes.
Eloise Tennyson.
Alfred Lord Tennyson. 2 marks out of 4. It's Tennyson's In Memoriam, and it goes, ring out old shapes of foul disease, ring out the narrowing lust of gold, ring out the 1,000 wars of old, ring in the 1,000 years of peace. And the next round is the why and wherefore department. Dilys Powell, in Du Maurier's story of Trilby, why did Trilby lose her voice and then die?
Her influence, who was Svengali,
Yes.
passed out of this world, and without him she couldn't sort of go on.
That's it. She was mesmerized by the Hungarian musician Svengali and sang beautifully while he was still there. When he dies, her voice went, and she went too. 2 marks. Denis Norden, in Pilgrim's Progress, why did Christian leave the city in which he and his family dwelt, and why didn't he take his family with him?
He called it the city of destruction.
Yes?
Because it was going to be destroyed. They wouldn't go with him.
Yes,
if
that's right.
I remember.
And why did he go? You more or less
Well, you
spelled it
know
out.
how it is if you can get rid of the family. Right, golly, what, you think he'd stop?
He believed in separate holidays.
Yeah. Well, he said, I asked you. All right, good enough. He was off like a shot.
I know he was, but another reason, please. You've given it already in the name of the city.
Because it was going to be destroyed.
Yes, fair enough. 2 marks. He left home because he'd read in a book, and you see him at the beginning with his burden on his back and reading the book, that the city was going to be burned with fire, and his family wouldn't come with him, and in spite of this, on the advice of Evangelist, he ran away from the city of destruction. I must say that his wife and family came on in part 2. That was a lot later.
Well, they always do.
Nancy Spain, why is the number 007 significant, and in what series of novels by whom?
Ian Fleming writes a series of novels in which James Bond appears. The titles? You want them?
No, I just want to know what 007...
Oh, it means you can kill.
You haven't given the vital clue.
Secret Service.
Secret Service. Once you get in that lot, anything can happen.
It does.
Good
Yes,
gracious,
you described
yes.
it very accurately, Nancy, and it's a very good resume of all the James Bond novels. Yes, only a very small number had this prefix, and
Only
they were the
7.
ones who were licensed to kill in the interest of their country. Frank Muir, why was Dickens, in some of his most popular novels, such a staunch supporter of the poor and underprivileged people of his day, and seemed always anxious to expose the ways in which the poor were exploited?
This is one of those sort of examination questions, isn't it? They want you to answer because you came from a poor family and had to work in a blacking factory in
Yes.
Bow. What's far more likely is that his literary tastes were formed by Fielding and Smollett, both of whom wrote mostly about picaresque bad people, and also, I think it's true, that he wrote extremely well about villains and villainy, and couldn't write for toffee about virtue and the virtuous. Oscar Wilde said, didn't he, about no man who hadn't a heart of stone could read of the death of little Nell without bursting into laughter.
Well, I think that's A-level with distinction, roundabout. 2 marks. But the easiest answer is the one Frank started with, that he lived in near poverty himself as the son of an extremely ill-paid clerk in government service who was imprisoned at one time in the Marshalsea prison for debt. And it all comes out in David Copperfield. And now we come to the last round, in which we go back to the quotations I gave the 2 teams earlier on in the programme. And I now want to know the origins of the quotations. First, Nancy Spain, your quotation, which was, "In the shade of the old apple tree."
Well, I don't know who wrote it. It's just one of those old songs.
What date, roughly?
Well, in the 19th century, it was
Yeah.
very vivid.
Yes, 1 out of 2. A Victorian music hall song. It was, in fact, by Harry Williams and Jack Judge, and
Oh,
Jack
I see.
Judge also wrote It's a Long Way to Tipperary. Now, Dilys Powell, your quotation, if you remember, was, "If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise."
Teddy Bear's Picnic.
Yes? I don't think you know the author,
I
Dilys.
have the faintest idea.
Well, it was written by one Jimmy Kennedy. 1 mark out of 2. And now I shall ask Denis Norden and Frank Muir for their explanation of how these words came to be said or written, and on this occasion the marks will be given according to which unlikely explanation arouses the larger and longer applause from the audience here in the studio. So back to Denis Norden with his quotation, "In the shade of the old apple tree."
Well, when my wife first raised the idea of keeping chickens, I tried to indicate my disapproval as subtly as possible. Chickens terrify me. I only have to be alone with a bird, and I come out into cold sweat, and chickens know it. When they're with me, they keep advancing towards me. And it doesn't matter how much I sob, it just sort of amuses them. And I put this to my wife, but she said, "But we'll have fresh eggs every day." And I said, "Look, if nature had meant us to keep chickens, would she have planted a supermarket 250 yards up the road?" You can't reason with women. She was determined. I said, "Well, I'm not paying for them. I'm not giving a penny." And she said, "I'll buy them out of my own money." And she bought them. She said, "I paced out the garden," and she said, "There's room for 30 chickens, and we'll have a small shed which we'll use as a hen house." So anyway, I came home one evening, which is an event in itself, and there they were. And I looked at her purchase, my eyes popped. What she'd bought was 15 chickens and 15 roosters. So I called her over. "Call me here," I said. "Call me here." I said, "You do realize that you only need 1 rooster for 30 chickens?" She looked at me levelly. "That," she said, is a typically masculine point of view. So there we were with these 15 couples in this shed, a sort of honeymoon hotel at the bottom of the garden. But it didn't work out exactly like that. You see, while my wife has sort of bucolic leanings, she hasn't really got the experience to back it up. And the chap she'd bought the roosters from must have, well, we have a phrase round our way, he must have seen her coming. Because these roosters were very, very elderly gentlemen. They were at that stage of life which Milton has described as in calm of mind, all passions spent. So there were no eggs. It took 14 days for my wife to latch on to what was going on, or what wasn't going on, that's what I should say. And when she did see the mistake she'd made, I must say she was very generous about it, and sort of typically feminine, a sort of guilt. She said, what have I done? I said, what do you mean? She said, those poor 15 elderly roosters, how bewildering it must have been this past fortnight to be cooped up in this little shed with 15 young hens, which is very true. And she repaired her error. She bought another shed for the 15 elderly roosters, which they could use as their own, to sort of potter about and talk about old times and go for a little stroll as far as the swing. And she bought a young rooster and put him in the original shed. I never took to him. I kept thinking of him as Roger Vadim. It just, the name. And we get eggs every day. And the strangest thing is that my feeling about chickens have changed, and it's this little shed with the 15 elderly roosters. I don't know whether it's because personally I've now what they call passed the meridian, but there is something. They are very old roosters. They don't crow till round about the 1 o'clock news. They need sleep, and I don't know, I've just sort of taken to them, and in fact spend most of my time now with them. I've got these two segregated communities, and that is more or less our home life now. My wife in one shed with this bustling community, and me, as it says in the song, in the shed of the older poultry.
And I've heard some odd animal stories in my time. Now we go back to Frank Muir, and if you remember, his quotation was, "If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise."
Don't you, like me, often wake up in the wee small hours of the morning and think, is not fate a fickle jade? There must be many of you, at least those of you who've had experiences where fate has suddenly struck a strange blow, who must have experienced that fate very often strikes a strange blow. This happened to me quite recently. It really was the most extraordinary thing. I'm still at a loss to explain it. It seemed quite a normal day. It was only a few days ago. I woke up and I put my trousers on and my socks and my shoes, and I went downstairs. Then I had my breakfast, and afterwards I played the Waters of Minnetonka on a child's piano with my big toes. The reason for this is that I always do exercises to strengthen my big toes every morning, because I have a morbid fear of falling forward. When I'd finished my toe strengthening exercises, I decided to go for a walk, and I realized I'd got odd socks on. But I obviously couldn't go walking through the village with odd socks on, so I decided the best thing to do would be to change my shoes for gum boots, and they wouldn't be noticed, you see. Then I collected my stepladder, because I always like to take a stepladder when I go for a walk, and it's just in case anybody wants you to help them change an electric light bulb, or in case there's a fear-crazed Afghan hound coming along the road. I have a morbid fear of fear-crazed Afghan hound. And I also took a bottle of horse liniment in case I tripped over and broke a knee, and also some ants' eggs just loose in my pocket, in case I met some starving goldfish. I think a lot of us don't look after our goldfish the way they should. You know? Just in case I ever see any looking thin, I always take a little. And I was walking along, and I found myself by the side of the River Thames. And while I was there, looking into the rather shallow waters, suddenly a thought struck me. I fished in my pocket, pulled out my diary, and I realized the most extraordinary thing, that at this very spot, by the side of the River Thames, 5 years previously, I'd been walking with my wife, and she'd leant over the water, and one earring had dropped into the water. Now, there's such an uncanny feeling, this, that 5 years ago, Thursday the 13th, 5 years previously, at this very spot, my wife had dropped this earring in the water. So I took a quick swig of horse liniment, put the ladder into the water, climbed in. Luckily, I had my gumboots on. It was quite shallow. And here is the most extraordinary thing. It just shows you 5 years ago, that very spot, and I fished around in that mud, and do you know I never found that earring? It's the end of my story. Some of you probably noticed I haven't brought the line in. Well, actually, I must confess that was done for a reason, because I really want to lose the contest this evening. I'm sorry about this, Dilys. I have to make an apology, but I've been nobbled. I've been got at to let Denis and Nancy win. You see, we're going to be terribly short of Coke at home. We can't get it. You see, and our Coke merchants, Messrs. Hugh Shaw and Company of Egham Yard, Egham, they won't let us have any, you see, because it's so short. And what I didn't realise was that the local bookmaker has opened a book, and you can place bets on who wins my word, whether it's Denis's team or my team, you see. And what's happened is, actually, I'm awfully sorry about this, I feel terribly guilty, really, it's a bit unethical. But we do need the Coke. It's not for the family, because, I mean, I can explain to my wife and children or hit them or something, but the dogs feel the cold terribly. And you see, they've said that if I throw the contest tonight, they wrote to me and told me, apparently they've all got, the whole firm's got 5 bob on Denis tonight. And they wrote and asked me if I'd throw the fight, if I'd lay down on the programme tonight, then the firm would give me as much Coke as I want. I've actually got the message they sent me this morning. It's written on a bit of a Coke sack. It's rather difficult to read. But it says, if you go down in the words today, Hugh Shaw offers big supplies.
Well, I always knew you were against doping, and that means that Frank wins. And that brings us to...
blow.
That brings us to a final score in which, nevertheless, Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, it's all right, Frank, get home with 2.5 marks ahead of Dilys and Frank Muir, and it also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The programme was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. Round one tries to test their vocabulary. 2 marks if they give me the meaning of the following words. Beginning with Nancy Spain. What is a wiseacre?
Somebody who knows everything.
Not quite.
Or thinks he knows.
Yes, that's more. He's a sententious dullard who assumes an air of wisdom, but is basically very much more simple. 2 out
Sounds
of
really
2.
like a bad wisdom tooth.
Yes, I think that hurts a bit more. Frank Muir, yours. The meaning of the word scroop. S-C-R-O-O-P. Scroop.
Scroop. Scroop.
It's a verb to help you.
Ah, yes. It's a nautical thing. You know, he popped onto the poop, scooped, and popped off again.
The captain would have objected.
It's a scraper for scraping
Yes.
the scoop. A scoop is a scraper for scraping the poop.
You're very nearly there. You stick to that line, and I'll give you some marks.
Well, I've stuck to it. Give me the marks. It's a poop scraper.
All right, I'll give you 1 out of 2 for the poop scraper, which isn't quite right. It's to make a grating, scratching, teeth-setting on edge noise. 1 out of 2. Dilys Powell, what is hartshorn?
It's a reviver.
Yes, it is.
It's a hartshorn ground up.
Mm-hmm. And what do you call it when it is ground up and it revives you?
Smelling salts.
It isn't originally that. It's a substance distilled from the horns of the hart or the young deer, but in its impure carbonate or solid form, it is smelling salts. You get your 2, I think. Denis Norden, what is a cross buttock?
Well, that would be the design left on a nudist who sat on a scrooper. No, it's one of these wrestling
Yes.
terms, which are all rather weird. Yes, it's a wrestling throw or hold.
Yes, throw.
Throw.
It's a throw over the hip, using the hip as lever in wrestling. I think probably Cumberland rather than Cornish. I'm not certain about that.
I use it in the foxtrot quite a bit.
But before we start round 2, I give each team a quotation which they can write down, and I want the 2 women members of the team to study their quotations, and at the end I shall ask them for the source that they come from. Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, here's your quotation. Save me, oh save me, from the candid friend. And Dilys Powell with Frank Muir, your quotation is, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. And then at the end of the programme, I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their ideas of how these words came to be said or written, and I don't want any of these answers just yet. And so round 2. Each of the following writers became pretty famous for their works, and for 2 marks, I want to know what was the title of their first book. Beginning with Nancy Spain. Nancy, Ernest Hemingway.
Very first book?
Yeah.
The Sun Also Rises,
Quite right.
also known as Fiesta.
Well done.
Which is silly because it's a ferry.
I'm going to give you a bonus mark, Nancy.
That's very good of you, Jack.
The title originally as published in America was The Sun Also Rises, but when it was published in England, it came under the title of Fiesta, and it was all about bullfighting and all sorts of other funny things. Frank Muir. James Thurber.
Oh. It was one he wrote when he was a reporter on the New Yorker.
That's it.
He wrote it in collaboration with somebody white.
Yes, quite right.
I can't remember his Christian name. And it's called Is Sex Necessary?
Well, that's jolly good. Is Sex Necessary? Written by James Thurber in collaboration with E.B. White, and I don't know his Christian name either. And then Dilys Powell H.G. Wells.
Kipps.
No, it was much later.
Love and Mr. Lewisham.
No. The first one was The Time Machine.
Ah,
All right, Denis Norden. The first work of F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Now, wait a minute. It's not Tender as the Night. Was it This Side of Paradise?
Yes, quite right. Well done, Denis. I think that's very hard. Well, then we have a round all about origins and derivations, and I have to mark it as best I can up to a possible maximum of 3 marks. What I want to know is the present meaning of the phrase and how it originated. Nancy Spain, in the doldrums.
Well, in the doldrums, there's no wind,
Mm-hmm.
Jack, and there are these bits of the earth outside of the trade winds,
Yes.
like in between southwest, sort of east-west of the beginning.
Yes, that's pretty accurate.
And the Caribbean will do very well for
Caribbean
fun.
wouldn't do too badly at all.
And it's terrible, actually. The sail flaps all day long, and there's no water, and they've all got scurvy. And
Oh, I see. Yes, that kind of water, yes.
yes,
To drink,
and
yes.
yeah, and oh, lorks.
No, you're doing terribly well, Nancy. I'll give you at least 2 marks for that.
That's good.
But tell me what the present meaning of the phrase is, to be in the doldrums.
Oh, it means that you haven't got a hope.
Yes.
Not a hope, you know. The bank manager has foreclosed on your overdraft, and
Yes. Before there are any more personal revelations, I'll give you 3 marks out of 3, Nancy, and well done. Means being thoroughly in the dumps and dejected. And Nancy's quite right. It's a bit inconveniently round the curve of the world between the northeast and the southeast trade winds round about the equator, where ships become becalmed or are bemused by very light and baffling winds. Frank Muir, to try it on the dog.
Oh. It means to experiment on an inferior person.
Yes.
It's presumably from food tasting.
Yes.
And they ran out of slaves or volunteers to taste the food. They tried it on the domestic animals
Why?
to see whether they're back arched after 5 minutes of the steak and kidney pie, and if so, they didn't eat it.
All right, fair enough, Frank. 3 out of 3, that's good enough. Dilys Powell, a bistro, B-I-S-T-R-O.
A bistro is a sort of small bar in Paris frequented by left-bank characters.
Yes. What happens there?
You drink.
Yes.
There's a drop to drink.
Yes. And
And you
how-
can have a coffee too.
You can have, that's important. You can have both coffee and
coffee.
alcohol, not necessarily together. And how does the name originate?
It means bistro, twice too much.
That's jolly clever.
I know the answer to
I'm
this.
going to give you an extra half mark for that. There's
I know the answer to this. Can I
well.
help? Well,
Yes, please.
Harry Rabinowitz, who was
Yes.
the musical director on Take It From Here when we
That's
used to
more
do
like
it, he's taught himself Russian. And it's the Russian for, please may I have a plate of food quickly.
absolutely right. Denis Norden, why is a coward called a coward?
Does it come from an Anglo-Saxon word?
No, I don't, no, it's
Along
French.
the lines of Quidad Rodrigo.
That's
Quidad Rodrigo. Careful, Roderick.
That's something to do with Wellington, not Napoleon. I get mixed.
Well, it can't be
Napoleon
Latin
will do.
because it's got a W in it, and they don't have W in Latin.
Oh, that might be a mistake. It might be a...
No,
mule.
stick to the Latin and the Italian, and then from there to the French. Nothing to do with Anglo-Saxon at all.
I do a bit of Russian as well. I think. I might delve off into Swedish. But, stay with me. Right.
I don't.
Covad. So that would be in Latin. It would be C-O-V.
No.
No.
Think of coda.
Codpiece. Yeah.
No, coda.
No, think
Coda
of coda,
is
the
the
end
ending.
bit, the end
The
bit.
end
Yes, the end bit.
Well, if you're a coward, you show
Yeah.
your end bit to your enemies
That's right.
rather than yes.
1.5 out of 3, because I gave a fair amount of help. It comes from the Latin cordar, which means a tail, and cowardice is shown either by turning tail, or if you're that particular kind of animal, by tucking your tail between your legs. And in fact, in heraldry, a lion is referred to as cowarded if its tail is shown on the shield, or whatever it is, between its legs. Well, the next round is the who and what department. For 2 marks, who or what is being referred to in the lines I'm going to quote, and 1 extra mark for naming the writer who wrote them. Nancy Spain. She saw her brother Peterkin roll something large and round, which he beside the rivulet in playing there had found.
Well, it was my little sister Wilhelmine who rolled the thing.
Yes,
And old Casper's work was done.
that's all the thing, yes.
And he, before his cottage door... What did you want to know exactly?
I want to know what it was he was rolling, and it's
It
rather...
was a skull, my dear.
You're quite right. And who wrote it? After Blenheim.
After Blenheim, Southey.
Yes, quite right. Well done, Nancy. "'Tis some poor fellow's skull," said he, "who fell in that great victory." Robert Southey, after Blenheim. Frank Muir, 2 lines which I won't quote because they would give it away, and then I go on.
Oh, charming.
I go on, Frank. "Her eyes were deeper than the depth of waters stilled at even." And if you wanted to call it Evan, I wouldn't mind.
The Blessed Damozel.
Yes.
Christina Rossetti.
No, the other one.
The other one. Oh, Dante Gabriel.
Well done. Now, Dilys Powell. "She is coming, my own, my sweet, were it ever so airy a tread, my heart would hear her and beat, were it earth in an earthy bed." Ah, who?
Maud.
By?
Alfred Lord Tennyson.
About?
Maud.
Yes. yes, a very sort of torrid poem by Lord Tennyson about Maud, who wanted to come out into the garden. 3 marks out of 3. Denis Norden. "For every time she shouted fire, they only answered little liar."
That's cautionary verses. Hilaire Belloc.
Yes.
And is it Matilda?
Yes.
Matilda.
Matilda, who told such dreadful lies, it made one gasp and stretch one's eyes. Well, then the next round is about mystery thrillers, which are thought to be classics of their kind. I want to know who wrote them. Nancy Spain, The Maltese Falcon.
Dashiell Hammett.
Quite right. Who also wrote...
Oh, come on, Jack.
No, I thought...
Glass Key.
Oh, sorry, no, you know too much. I meant The Thin Man. 2 marks, Nancy, well done. Frank Muir, The Lady in the Lake.
Eileen Dover. My children have comics with little jokes along the top.
Don't laugh at them, they're our bread and butter.
Raymond Chandler wrote that.
Yes, Raymond Chandler is the answer we prefer. 2 marks. Dilys Powell, A Study in Scarlet.
We should know that.
Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle.
Quite right, 2 marks. And Denis Norden, The Postman Always Rings Twice.
James M. Cain.
Quite right, 2 marks it is. I was all surprised, because in England the postman's supposed to knock. In America he apparently rings.
Yeah.
Curious
Yeah.
thing. Well, now we come to the final round, and we go back to the quotations I gave the 2 teams earlier on the programme. I now want to know the origins of those quotations. First, Nancy Spain, your quotation was, "Save me, oh, save me, from the candid friend."
I don't know.
Well, it's George Canning, who was Foreign Secretary and later Prime Minister, but also wrote a fair amount of verse. Now, Dilys Powell, here is your quotation. "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy."
It's a proverb.
Yes.
Is that enough?
Not quite. It doesn't come in the Book of Proverbs, is that what you mean?
No, it's not biblical. No, it's, I believe, it's a character called Ray.
Yes, he's the wrong one. It was Thomas Fuller, who also wrote Fuller's Worthies, but he wrote a book with a Latin title called Gnomologia, and this was the one in which this proverb appeared.
He also wrote a book on geography, didn't he? Earth.
There's Pearl S. Fuller. Well, now, I shall ask Denis Norden and Frank Muir for their explanation of how these words came to be said or written, and on this occasion the marks will be given to whichever unlikely explanation arouses the longer and perhaps louder applause from the audience here in the studio. So back to Denis Norden and his quotation, which was, "Save me, oh save me, from the candid friend."
I wonder if any of you have had a lady so in love with you that she threw herself into a vat of warm, transparent toffee. Now, this happened to me when I was very young, and I was working for a factory that made petit four. For the benefit of those people who have to avoid calories and may have forgotten, petit four are not the opposite of plus four. They are little sweetmeats that restaurants serve with coffee, and the ones we made took the form of slices of tangerine or grapes that were dipped into transparent toffee. And I was actually in charge of the tangerine department. We had this enormous vat of warm, transparent toffee, and people used to come along with slices of tangerine and throw them in, and we allowed them to stay in there until they glistened, and then we'd pull them out with sort of large shrimping nets, and they'd be rushed along to a refrigerated room till they were hardened to the consistency that would just set your fillings shrieking. And then they would be rushed in lorries to the coffee tables of millions. Well, I was in charge of this, as I say. It was quite an everyday sort of job, except for this expanse of winking, bubbling toffee, and Hilda, who was another winking, bubbling expanse. She was a large lady. I was very young at that time, about 3 times my age, and very sweet tooth. In fact, I think that was why she was attracted to me. When I was young, I had a very big head and a very long, thin body. And it may have been associated with toffee apples, but there was something that drew me to her, or drew her to me. I felt nothing in return. I was at the age when I wasn't, you know how you are at 17, you're not really very interested in women. Well, you're thinking about girls all the time, you see. And so she made all sorts of advances which I ignored. I didn't even know they were advances at that age. You're a bit silly then. And it would have gone on and on. I thought she might despair of it. And suddenly one day I heard a splash. And there she was in this enormous vat of transparent toffee, which was warm, it wasn't hot. And I panicked and sort of pulled her out, and there she lay motionless and with her eyes closed. I didn't know what to do. And so I started applying artificial respiration, pumping her arms up and down. She just sort of gasped, "No, no, the kiss of life." So I gave her the kiss of life for about 25 minutes. It probably would have gone on longer, but we heard the foreman approaching, and she suddenly recovered. Well, I thought nothing of it, one of those miraculous escapes she'd had, till the next day, around about 3 o'clock, splash. She was in the warm, transparent toffee again, you see. This time, kiss of life took about 3/4 of an hour. Do you know, it went on every day. From then, splash. Warm, transparent toffee, kiss of life. We got practically no work done. Finally, I began to suspect she might be doing it purposely. So I said to her, "Hilda, you must realize there is a possibility that this slipping into the vat of warm, transparent toffee might be a sort of psychosomatic slipping. If it is, I must tell you that we can be nothing more than good friends." And she said, "Yes, oh yes, I perfectly understand that." Splash. Well, 6 months later, I could stand it no more. By this time, she was sort of permanently coated with thin, transparent toffee, which was the reason, probably, why I used the adjective in the memo that I sent to the personnel manager, which said, "Save me, oh save me, from the candied friend." friend.
Well, that puts a gloss on the word sweetie. And we'll go on to Frank Muir. And if you remember, his quotation was, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy."
Ah, yes. Yes, I said that quotation quite recently. Those of the listeners who are avid listeners to this program, I mean, probably both of them remember that occasionally I've talked about having a boat. Well, I did have a boat. I had a boat for 5 years, but I've got it no longer because, rather unfortunately, it turned turtle. It fell off a lorry. You see, it was being brought up from the south coast, and the lorry took a corner rather swiftly. My boat rolled off the lorry, and it was a complete write-off. So this was rather embarrassing to me, because actually I was going to let Jack Longland have the use of the boat that summer as a sort of birthday present, you see, because our markings were getting a bit rough this side of the table, and I don't want you to think that I was attempting to influence him in any way. It's the very last thing I'd do. I tried everything else, and that was the last thing that was left. It wasn't influence at all. It was just, what's the word, a bribery, really. And I thought that if I gave him the use of the boat in the summer, it'd be, he would favour our side. But now I had no boat. So it was Bob a Job week. So I sent the Boy Scouts along. There were, 18 in the local troop with 3 trek carts. So I sent them along to salvage what was left of the wreckage and bring it home. Naturally, I looked after them. I paid them well above the price. I sent the scoutmaster a cheque for 1 and 6, and they'd returned with the boat wheel and the propeller and 2 oak planks. That was all that was left worth saving. How to make a birthday present for Jack out of this? Well, I used my head. I didn't panic. I took the ship's wheel and I sawed all the 10 knobbly spokes off. And I thought of sending those to him as 10 spare tin opener handles. But it didn't ring, it didn't seem a very nice present. Then I thought of sending him the propeller from the boat, saying, here, for your birthday, I thought you'd rather like a spare washing machine agitator. But that sort of didn't make sense, so I just had to do something with these 2 oak planks. Now, they were 1.25 inches thick, and none of the plywood, of course, was saved. It was just these solid oak planks. What to do with 2 oak planks? I thought, well, Jack smokes a lot. What if one day he'd like to smoke a salmon? Because when you smoke salmon, you smoke it over oak chips. So immediately I grabbed a plank and ran along to our local fried fish shop, and I put the plank under the chipper. He's an awful nice chap, he didn't mind. And I swung the handle down, but it doesn't make chips out of an oak plank at all. It just sort of bent the handle and made no impression on the oak at all. So the oak chips was out. And I thought and thought and thought. And I thought that Jack's, sort of fairly sporty chap, perhaps water skis. So I made these 2 planks into water skis. So I sawed the corners off to make the pointed end. Then, of course, I had to bend them up. Well, I heaved and strained. I couldn't bend them at all. Then I went down to the bottom of the garden and I wedged the pointed end under the garden gate. Then I rolled a tree trunk underneath to make a sort of fulcrum quite near that. And I climbed on top of the gate and jumped on the far end of the plank. It was a lovely feeling, It's really one of the most exciting moments of my life. It's a bit difficult getting down from the tree, but it was... the whole thing was it didn't bend the plank at all, not permanently. Then I remembered that you can bend planks with steam. So I took the plank into the kitchen and put the kettle on and held the pointed end in the steam. And it is terribly interesting, this, that if you hold an oak plank 6 foot long, you hold the pointed end in the steaming kettle for 8 minutes, then withdraw it sharply. The other end of the plank goes straight through the kitchen window. So I gave up the idea of water skis. Then I thought if I could make these oak planks into a piece of furniture, that'd be the obvious thing. A chest of drawers would be ideal. But 2 planks. I mean, how can one make a chest of drawers? So then I had an inspiration, and with 5 weekends and 2 evenings, I cut 2 little strips off the top of 1 plank. And I put the planks upright, 6 foot high, glued 200 empty matchboxes in between them, and I had a very, 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 very high, rather narrow chest of drawers. But I did have my present, and I looked at it and I thought, well, my 2 bits of oak did make a present for Jack, and it really, that's when I said this proverb, it brought it to life. You see, all oak and no ply makes Jack a tall boy.
Well, by your applause, Frank Muir wins the contest of stories, and I get a quite unusable present. And that brings us to a final score in which Frank Muir and Dilys Powell just scrape home by 1/2 mark from Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, and it also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The programme was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. Here's round 1 to test their vocabulary. 2 marks if they can get the meaning of the following words approximately right. Beginning with Nancy Spain. Nancy, what is a glossographer? Glossographer.
It's somebody who compiles a glossary.
You're quite right. A commentator or a writer of glosses writing about words. Well done, 2 marks. Frank Muir, what is a twite?
Twite? A nocturnal twit. If you
Frank, leave out the nocturnal and I'll give it to you, more or less.
Well, it's a twit.
All right, define.
Define?
40 shillings.
For the home service. It's,
You've left out the to and the woo.
To wit, to woo. Oh, twite. It's a white owl.
It's not quite. Well, at any rate, it's feathered and it flies. So I'll give you 1 mark out of 2. It's a kind of linnet, a linnet that lives in hilly and moorland districts, called a twite. Dilys Powell, what is a weasand? Some people call it weasand. I don't know if that helps. W-E-A-S-A-N-D, weasand.
It's an archaic word.
It is fairly archaic.
Don't use it anymore.
Get it slit.
Yes, it's kind of throat.
Yes, it is. I'll slit your weasand means I'll cut your throat. Comes in Shakespeare, among other things. 2 marks. Denis Norden, what is tympanitis? Tympanitis. Tympanitis.
Well, it's something to do with a drum.
Yeah.
Tympanum is a big drum.
This is a little drum.
Oh, it's a little drum.
Inflammation of ears, I would think.
Nancy thinks it's inflammation of the ear.
Yes, she's absolutely right. You stick to that.
Exactly right.
Absolutely right.
She's a
It's inflammation of the lining membrane of the middle ear, a particularly nasty kind of earache, and you get your 2 marks thanks to Nancy.
Yes.
All right. Well, before we start round 2, I'm going to give each team a quotation for them to write down, and the 2 women members of the team, I hope, will study them, and at the end of the program will tell me where those particular quotations come from. Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, your quotation is it a world to hide virtues in? And Dilys Powell with Frank Muir, yours is, you're the flower of my heart, sweet Adeline. And also at the end of the program, I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their ideas of how these words came to be said or to be written. Well, now round 2. Origins and derivations. These are phrases or words. I want to know what they mean now and what they meant originally, as well how they came to have the present meaning. 3 marks is a possible maximum. Nancy Spain, to hoist the blue Peter.
Well, it means nowadays it means that you're going on regardless
Mm-hmm. Yes.
of everything.
Yes.
And it's a little flag with a blue edge and a white middle,
Yes.
which means that you've been cleared for going on regardless.
Yes, that's it. Absolutely right. 3 marks. It means to leave nowadays. Naval flag, as Nancy quite rightly says, with a blue ground and white square in the middle, hoisted when the ship is about to leave port and sail. And it was originally, apparently, though this seems very improbable, a repeater flag, a naval flag that you hoisted to signify that the chap at the other end had been a bit of an ass and hadn't understood what you'd already put up, and therefore wanted the signal repeated. So it really was a blue repeater. Frank Muir, the word catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
Now and originally.
It's a 4-syllable word.
Mm-hmm.
It means a violent, sudden disaster
Yes?
of cataclysmic proportions.
Yes,
It comes from an ancient tongue.
Yes.
Catastrophe. In the first Olympic Games, I think it was, it comes from the Greek, Jack.
It does.
And there was, when they came to award the cup or trophy, they found that it was gone. The cat had got it. And the cat as trophy is the old Greek for catastrophe. And ever since, oddly enough, the word has come to mean that. 4 marks. Next.
1 out of 3. It now means a disaster, as Frank Muir says, of such a cataclysmic kind that it upsets the natural order of things. But it came from the Greek theatre. It was the turning upside down of the action that you get halfway or 2/3 of the way through a tragedy, mostly. The sudden change, which shows you what the end is going to be. For instance, when Oedipus, who's had a terrible prophecy about him, finds, so far from being successful and a king, that he has fulfilled the prophecy and killed his father and wedded his mother. That's the catastrophe of that particular tragedy. Dilys Powell, the phrase, you can whistle for it.
You can whistle for it.
Well,
Whistle
means
and
you
I'll
won't-
come
means
to
you
you,
won't
my
get
lad.
it. Means you won't-
Burns.
Yes, it means you won't get
won't
it.
get it.
And originally?
Whistling down the wind.
Yes?
Oh, whistling down the wind.
Whistling up the wind.
Up the wind.
Whistling down the wind.
Yes,
That's a naval term.
Yes, it's
It's a naval term.
When they were
It's a naval
becalmed in the
term.
doldrums, they got the old boat out and started rowing. They all whistled. They whistled. and they hoped that a wind would come.
They didn't. So
You get your 3 marks between you.
thank you, Frank.
It means something you're not going to get, whatever it happens to be. If a chap owes you money and you ask for it and he tells you you can whistle for it, it means he isn't going to pay you back. And it is the old superstition among sailors that if you were becalmed, if all the sailors whistled, then the wind would spring up. I think they must have tried very often and it didn't work, and hence it comes to mean a disappointment. Denis Norden, a preliminary canter.
Well, it's a sort of dummy run.
Yes. And literally and originally.
I suppose it's horse racing. They have that little sort of... is it when they go up to the starting post?
Quite right, David.
They have that little run up there to, so that you can have a look at them and see what you're going to bet on.
3 marks, Dennis, that's quite right. It's something which is a kind of trial run, and it is the run from the paddock to the starting point, which loosens the horses up and I suppose helps the punters. The word canter itself originally meant the Canterbury pace, or the Canterbury gallop, because that was the way in which the pilgrims were supposed to ride towards the shrine of St. Thomas of Becket at Canterbury, meant going at the horse's own pace and not hurrying up too much. The next round's the who, why, and what department. 2 marks if they get it right. Nancy Spain, why was the knight-at-arms alone and palely loitering?
Because the sedge was
I
withered.
thought you'd say that, and it's quite wrong.
Why? Well, he had this friend, you know. He put her on his horse, and sideways would she lean, and
That's it.
and she put him into this trance of it's
Enthrall.
like enthrall. She had him. Yes, that's right.
Yes, and she was called?
La Belle Dame Sans Merci.
2 marks. Poem by Keats, which starts, "Oh, what can ail thee, knight-at-arms, alone and palely loitering, although the sedge is withered from the lake and no birds sing." He'd fallen in love with La Belle Dame Sans Merci, and that had put him into a terrible tizzy. Frank Muir, to whom is the speaker of the following lines making an apology, and what are the words he uses to justify his behaviour? "All night long upon mine heart I felt her warm heart beat. Night long within mine arms in love and sleep she lay. Surely the kisses of her bought red mouth were sweet."
It's Noddy explaining to Big Ears what he was doing with the rag doll.
You can tear yourself from the nursery, Frank.
Let's have it again,
Gerald.
Jack. Let's have it again. Is it?
Yes.
Night long within mine arms in love and sleep she lay. Surely the kisses of her bought red mouth.
Oh, Dowson.
Lilies.
Yeah,
He
I
was-
got it, yes.
It was the girl he waltzed with,
Dowson.
and he regretted the lilies. It's,
That's it,
but I'll be faithful to thee, Sonara,
That's it.
after my fashion.
I think that's good enough, Frank. It's Ernest Dowson's "I've been faithful to the Sonara in my fashion." So he's apologizing to Sonara, his former love, for the bought kisses of his present one. Dilys Powell, what is a sob sister?
A sob sister is a female journalist who gets her foot in the front door and bursts into tears on your shoulder and elicits from you the entire story of your private life.
Best description I've ever heard. I think it's absolutely super. 2 marks. Shakespeare knew about it. He said, "See how my wretched sister sobs and weeps." He must know all about them. Now, Denis Norden. "These are the mountebanks of state, who by the sleight of tongues can crimes create, and dress up trifles in the robes of fate, the mastiffs of a government, to worry and run down the innocent."
Well,
What was the author talking about? Who, rather?
Inland Revenue.
Well, yes, if there had been at that time, that might have done.
I don't know. Dress up trifles in robes.
Be Rome.
Messy.
Yes.
Julius Caesar, I think.
Julius Caesar.
No, you were nearer with your first guess. That's,
What with the Inland Revenue? Accountants.
Another profession. You're getting nearer.
Lawyers.
Yes.
Lawyers.
Lawyers. Do we know the author?
No.
1 out of 2. It's Daniel Defoe writing about lawyers in a rather unkind way. And now we try to test the team's knowledge of literature, both old and new. 2 marks again. Nancy Spain, the name, please, of the main hero of Robert Louis Stevenson's novel Kidnapped and its sequel Katrina.
David Balfour.
Quite right. He was carried off to the Carolines, wasn't he? 2 marks.
Right.
Frank Muir, the name of the infatuated hero of Somerset Maugham's novel Of Human Bondage?
James Bond.
It's a difficult one, this.
Oh, yes. Oh, dear, oh, dear, oh, dear. He was infatuated with that girl, Hop-Along, limping waitress.
That's it.
Hop-Along tea tray. He was a student.
He was a
wasn't
student.
Yes, he
medical
was.
Student.
And tall, thin chap, and his name, well, she called him Darling, when her bought red mouth was closed.
Half a mark, and a good deal about the plot. Chap's name was, in fact, Philip Carey, the hero of Human Bondage. Dilys Powell, one of the most popular of recent Russian writers, was Mikhail Alexandrovich Sholokov. I wouldn't know whether that's the right way to pronounce it. Can you name... We'll ask Denis.
Correct you, Jack. You've got it in front of you.
I'm not very good at Russian. All right, we'll try him again. Mikhail Sholokov. Name any one of his novels, the title, preferably the name in which they were published in English.
Quiet Flows the Don.
Yes, there's a word you've left out.
And Quiet
All
Flows
right.
the Don.
And quiet flows the dawn, and then there was The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea and Virgin Soil Upturned, novels by Sholokov. Denis Norden, why were Sir Walter Scott's novels known as the Waverley novels, although only the first, published in 1814, was titled Waverley?
Is this something to do with the fact that he wrote anonymously?
Yes.
I didn't read that.
You didn't? You didn't?
Anonymously.
Yes, he wrote anonymously, son of anonymously, and quiet flows anonymously, virgin anonymously upturned. I should think because they didn't know the author of it, if he wrote them anonymously.
I think 1.5, Denis, out of 2. From the date when he published Waverley until he went to a dinner in Edinburgh as in 1827, 13 years later, and said he was the author, all his novels were published as being written by the author of Waverley. So they became known as the Waverley novels. He was referred to as the Great Unknown because they were all trying to find out who it was. Now we come to the last round and go back to those quotations I gave the two teams earlier on in the programme. For 2 marks, Nancy Spain, can you give me the origin of your quotation? Is it a world to hide virtues in?
It's in Twelfth Night.
Yes.
And Sir Toby Belch is ticking off Sir Andrew Aguecheek for saying something terribly silly about virtue.
It's 2 marks. You've got the characters. It's Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, and Sir Toby Belch is trying to spur Sir Andrew Aguecheek on to woo a bit more confidently than he seems likely to do. Well done. Act 1, Scene 3. Now, Dilys Powell, the origin of your quotation: "You're the flower of my heart, sweet Adeline."
It's a popular song.
Mm-hmm.
It's always sung in drunken scenes in American films by elderly business executives.
You wouldn't know either the words or the music, who they were by.
No, I honestly wouldn't.
I think that's jolly hard to know, I must say. Music was by a chap called Harry Armstrong, who named himself the Old Faithful of the Harmonic Geezers. And the words were by a chap called Richard Girard. It was written in 1903, and as Dilys says, it's repeated at almost every American dinner ever since. Well, now I ask Denis and Frank to tell me their explanation of how these quotations really came into being, and on this occasion the marks will go to whichever unlikely explanation receives the longer amount of applause from the audience here in the theatre. So back to Denis Norden with his quotation: "Is it a world to hide virtues in?"
I want to dedicate this story to somebody. It's a rare step to take publicly, but I really feel I should. I want to dedicate this story to a very humble person who came to my help at a time when none of the rest of the world was coming to my help. I had a very particular problem. I don't know whether, I think it happens with everybody, that there's one area of knowledge, there's one subject about which all the rest of the world seems to know, and you don't know anything. So whenever this subject comes up, you have to sort of bluff your way through. It's escaped you all your life. If you've got, with some people, it's classical music. But with me, this area of ignorance has always been the Venerable Bede. Now, as everybody knows, except me, the Venerable Bede was a character who appeared in early English history, and I never, as we say in school, did him. I never really knew anything about the Venerable Bede, and whenever the subject cropped up in conversation, which it does, strangely, if you don't know about it, you always seem to be with people who are talking about the Venerable Bede. And I used to have to sort of play it rather close to my chest and say, oh, yes, the Venerable Bede, yes, what a grand old trooper he was. Deceitful, which isn't nice. And finally came the point, and I thought, well, I really must put this right. So I went along to my local adult evening classes, education classes. There was a very nice porter there. And I said, could you take me to the lady who enrolls? And he took me to the lady who enrolls. And I said, I would like to put myself down for a course of the Venerable Bede. And she said, well, we don't do a course on only the Venerable Bede. If you particularly want a course on any one subject, we arrange that course providing there are a minimum of 15 people requiring it. I said, I shall get 15 people, so she sort of sniffed. I didn't like her. She reminded me of my former history master, except for the moustache. He was clean-shaven, actually. But, well, now, I had then the task of acquiring 14 other people who were willing to give up a Tuesday evening to go to an adult evening class to learn about the Venerable Bede. Now, that is not as easy as it sounds. It took me ages and ages, and I managed to get 13 people, but I could not get the 14th. Finally, I went back to the adult evening class place, and I found this very nice porter that I told you about before, and I said, look, will she do it if there's only 14 people? Will she lay on a course about the Venerable Bede? And he said, she won't. He said, she's a right, and he used a word which means tartar, actually. She's a right tartar, that one. So my face fell, and he said, what's the matter, chum? And I told him. And you know what he said? He said, look, he said, I can see that you are a true pursuer after knowledge, not one of those fly-by-nights who come here just to come in out the rain. He said, I will become the 15th. And he became the 15th member, and because we had 15, we have now a course starting next month on the Venerable Bede, and within about 3 months I should be able to hold my own in any conversation. And I would like to dedicate my story tonight to that porter. His name is Alfred Knight, known to his friends, of whom I count myself one, as Alf, and to him I would like to dedicate this story. To him I would dedicate Is It a World to Hide Virtues In? To Alf Knight.
I'm absolutely purring because I get a special snob rating tonight. I once taught students from the College of the Venerable Bede. And now, Frank Muir, and you remember Frank Muir's quotation was, "You're the flower of my heart, sweet Adeline."
I was recently faced with a problem so strange, so bizarre, so challenging. I couldn't rest, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep until I'd solved it. This is about 25 minutes ago, actually, just before... while we were standing backstage, I was just sort of musing, looking down on my shoes, actually, and just pondering, the way one does, why one's big toes are on the inside of the feet instead of on the outside, where they'd have much more control, where you wouldn't tend to keel over to the right or left in a high wind. And while I was looking, I suddenly noticed that there was some white powder on my jacket. This is incredible. I mean, how did white powder get on my jacket, this sort of white stuff? This was a challenging thought. I just couldn't think. I went back over what had happened. Was it... I said, "Little white powder, what are you?" I said, "Are you talcum powder?" I thought to myself, I wonder if it could be something rubbed off, some sort of powder rubbed off a rhubarb pate, because I was all twisted up in a small service lift in a canteen. And you know, at lunchtime I was squashed up in a small service lift in a canteen. Yes, it was at the BBC, you see. We were down there having lunch at the television centre, and it's one of these self-service canteens, and I got my food, and I queued up, and I'd ordered the veal loaf stuffed, and I looked up on the little sort of printed thing, and it said sweets, cold, jelly, or another kind of jelly, sweets hot, Adelina. So I said to the woman, what's that? Oh, she said, it's a patty. She said, it's a rhubarb patty. And I mused while she was, you know what they do while you're away, they slam little tin doors, don't they, in canteens, and shuffle chips. Whenever they've got nothing to do, they always shuffle chips. And I was musing that why it was called Adelina was obviously after Miss Adelina Patti, the opera singer, who was inordinately fond of rhubarb. In fact, when she used to give concerts at her house in Wales, the crowds outside always used to shout, rhubarb, rhubarb, rhubarb. And obviously they'd made a rhubarb patty and called it Adelina. So I said, I'll have the Adelina. Well, I went to my place, and I sat down, and a woman came and took the tray away, and I'd eaten my veal loaf stuffed, and I'd got down to just a few fragments of hard bits of chip, which I was trying to wedge between the prongs of my fork. And suddenly, about 3 tables away, it was very crowded, I suddenly saw Bill Cotton, who's a very old friend of ours, young Bill Cotton, and he had a vacant place beside me, and he waved me over. He said, come on, I want to talk to you. So I hadn't got my tray, so I lifted my plate full of my rhubarb patty, and I tucked my spoon and fork under my arm, and I picked up my little cardboard pot of cream, which I bought because we're working, you know, and we can afford it. And I went over and threaded my way to Bill's table. When I got there, somebody else had sat down, you see, and there was now no place. And she was starting on her lamb and mint sauce. So I tried not to look as though I was, you know, made rather a boob. So I went back to my place. Meanwhile, somebody else had slipped in there, you see. And there were now no seats, and I had in my hand my rhubarb patty, Adelina, my little pot of cream in the other hand, and my spoon and fork under my arm, and nowhere to sit. And they were queuing at the door. So I tried to look, you know, as though it was nothing, and people were starting to pass remarks. It was terribly embarrassing. They were saying, why is he standing up eating a rhubarb patty? Has he got some disease, you know, which renders sitting down uncomfortable, or has he been riding upon a horse? And I got so nervous that I ran through the kitchens, through those swing doors with the little windows, and into the kitchens, and the chef said, oh, you can't come in here. And I said, I must, you will excuse me. And there's a little service lift there, and I crammed myself in that, and my patty went hard against my coat, and I worked the rope, and I went downstairs and escaped. But you see, the patty was pressed hard up against my coat, and I remembered that the waitress, just before she gave me the patty, sprinkled a little flour on it, just to make it look nice. So I said to my little stain, the mystery is solved. I know what you are, little white powder. You're the flower of my hot, sweet Adelina.
Well, I hope the manager of the BBC canteen doesn't give notice tomorrow. Well, by your vote, Frank's story wins, and that brings us to a final score in which Dilys Powell and Frank Muir have 1.5 marks less than Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, who therefore win. It also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The program was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. And we go straight into round one to test their vocabularies. 2 marks if they get the meaning of the following words approximately right. Beginning with Dilys Powell. Dilys, what is a coven? C-O-V-E-N.
It's a meeting of witches.
Quite right, an assembly of witches. Oddly enough, it comes from the same root as the word that produces convent, but those are much nicer girls. Denis Norden, what is a wanderoo? W-A-N-D-E-R-O-O, wanderoo.
A wanderoo. Well, it's what happens, Jack, when somebody loves you. There's a song that goes, if I remember, somebody loves me, a wanderoo.
Yeah. It's Australian.
Yes. A wanderoo it can be. No, yeah. I tell you what it could be. It could be a kangaroo that has fallen out the pouch and is just going around looking for its mum. It's called a wanderoo.
If it had fallen out and fallen upwards and landed in a tree, it would be nearer the real meaning.
It would only fall upwards if its mummy had hiccups.
Dennis, I'm going to give you one for the magnificent bit of song. It is in fact an animal, but it's a kind of monkey, a monkey that lives in Ceylon. Yeah. Nancy Spain, what is a piker? P-I-K-E-R, piker.
Somebody who's trying to get out of paying their debts.
Not quite, I think, Nancy. Well, what do you do to start with before you make the debt? No.
Well, you have to gamble.
Yes, that's more like it.
Well, what other debts do you have?
1.5, I think. A chap who is a poor sport, which is the impression that Nancy conveyed, but it's an overcautious gambler who is terribly worried the whole time that he's going to lose. Frank Muir, the word is aloetic. A-L-O-D-T-I-C, aloetic.
Good, I thought I was going to get a difficult one. Aloetic.
Aloetic.
Aloetic. Tic means appertaining to, doesn't it? Having the qualities of.
Yes, you've got it if you go
Poetic means being like Edgar Allan Poe. Aloetic. Aloetic.
Yes.
It means
put it in the plural.
Aloetics. Hello, who's your lady friend? Somebody who welcomes. What? Hang on. Aloes.
Yes.
Oh, bitter danke. It's appertaining to aloes.
You're absolutely right, you've got there in the end. It's to do with aloes. It might be a medicine containing aloes, which is a strong purgative drug. Well, before we start round 2, I'm going to give each team a quotation for them to write down, and I want the 2 women members of the team to study their quotations, and then at the end of the programme I shall ask them where those quotations come from. Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, your quotation is, are you sick or are you sullen? And Dilys Powell with Frank Muir, yours is, It takes a great deal of history to produce a little literature. And at the end of the program, I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their ideas of how these words came to be said or written. The next round is about verse and poetry, and in this round I give each member of the team a quotation and ask them for the following line or lines to complete it. 2 marks if they can complete the quotation, and 2 more for naming its source. Dilys Powell. I hold it true, whate'er before, I feel it when I sorrow most.
Tennyson.
Yes, Tennyson.
Tennyson. It's that one about loving and losing.
Yes, that's it.
It's better to have loved and lost
Yes.
than never to have loved at all.
Quite right, absolutely right. Do you remember the poem? Doesn't matter.
But don't
No.
bother them.
In memoriam.
In memoriam. Well done, Dilys. 4 marks. Now, Denis Norden. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw.
Kubla Khan,
Yes.
Coleridge. Damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played Somebody Loves Me, a wanderoo. That was the origin of a wanderoo.
Well done, Denis. 4 marks, but what she was actually singing about was Mount Abora. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid. On her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Nancy Spain. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace.
Well, this is Andrew Marvell.
Andrew Marvell.
Finishes up about what fun it is to sport.
Yes.
And about the hot breath of time on his
Yes,
shoulders.
winged chariot,
and so
yeah.
on,
With
yes.
times winged chariot.
Times winged chariot, hurrying near.
2 marks, I think, Nancy. Andrew Marvell to his coy mistress. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may. And there's times winged chariot a bit later. Frank Muir. Fear no more the lightning flash, nor the all-dreaded thunderstone.
Fear no more the lightning flash, nor the dreaded thunderstone. It's ancient,
Yes,
thunderstone. Pre-Shakespeare.
yes. No, it's not pre-Shakespeare.
Oh, it's Shakespeare, Jack. Golden lads and lasses must
Yes.
what?
Like something other come to dust.
Make sport.
Thou thy something work
Yes.
had done, something I've gone and paid thy wages.
Shall not go on and pay
Paid
their
thy
wage.
wages. Sorry, go on.
Go on, I had no idea.
Go.
I thought it was
You've got
Greasy
to-
Joan doth keel the pote.
2 marks already for knowing it for Shakespeare. I don't think you're going to get much further over the next lines. 2.5 perhaps for knowing about the golden lads and girls all must, like chimney sweepers come to dust. It's Fideli's dirge in Cymbeline, Shakespeare. Fear no more the lightning flash nor the all-dreaded thunderstone. Fear not slander, censure rash. Thou hast finished joy and moan. All lovers young, all lovers must consign to thee and come to dust.
Very good. Expressed. Good thought.
Well, the next round is origins and derivations, and I've got to try and use my discretion to mark these up to a maximum of 3. What it means now and what the origin is. Dilys Powell, the phrase, to sail under false colours.
It means now to pretend to be somebody or not.
Yes?
Well, it must have been, it's a nautical expression,
Mm-hmm.
and you must have run up the wrong flag
In order?
in order to deceive the enemy.
Yes, fair enough. That's 3 marks. Means nowadays to try and attain your object by appearing to be quite other than you are. And if you ran up the wrong flag, particularly if you were a pirate, people might be unsuspecting and let you get far too close, and then it was all over. Captain.
Actually, it's ran the wrong flag up rather than ran up the flag.
Yes,
Get that clear in our minds.
I accept the correction, Frank. So would Captain Hornblower. Denis Norden. Grand Guignol.
Well, that's an entertainment that's very bloody and gory, and it comes from the French.
Yes.
Be no fool, this lad. And wait a minute, Guignol is the sort of Punch and Judy show
Yes.
that they have in the Champs-Élysées.
That's all right.
But this is bigger.
And Grand Guignol is a big punch.
Yes, I think you'll get your three, Dennis. Nowadays, a series of plays, sensational, gruesome, and so on. And as Dennis quite rightly said, Guignol, which was the name of a theatre in Paris, Grand Guignol, was the principal character in the French puppet show, very like our Punch and Judy, in the 18th century. 3 marks. Nancy Spain, a lampoon.
A lampoon, well, it's one of these dreary satires where you take the energy from somebody and transmogrify it, you know, parasitical stuff.
Yeah.
And
Comes from?
I suppose that it's been going on for years, really. Rowlandson, people like that,
Yeah.
18th century. I suppose you'd have a poon, like the boys make, you know, a good poon. And then you'd have a lame poon, you know, like you and I make, Jack.
Or I think 1.5 for mixture of knowledge and effrontery. A bit of sarcastic personal satire. It probably comes from French lampon, let us drink or guzzle. It was part of the refrain of a 17th century French drinking song.
Probably does.
À la lampon.
A la lampon.
1 lampon, 2, please.
Frank Muir, the expression washout.
Means a flop, a failure,
Yeah.
washout. It's midsummer test matches at Old Trafford. It means when things are washed out by moisture. Therefore, the whole thing's a failure.
And apart from test matches, you're very nearly there, Frank. What else might get washed out or away?
Washout. Sea.
It takes a lot of doing.
Yeah. Oh, it's a nautical expression, Jack. Chance would have it. And it comes from when they're doing their dough-being on the aft deck, and there's a following sea, and very often the vests are carried overboard, and that was called a washout. When the washing is washed
One,
out.
I think.
What's your story?
Well, as you said, Frank, it means a complete failure or fiasco. And
I didn't say
if it
that.
says washout, means disregard the order that's been given. But there are 2 explanations, which you can take a pick among.
The Swede is mine.
One is a break in a railway line or a road track caused by flood or downpour, as Frank suggested. The other is that it's naval slang. When you wrote down a signal message, you put it down on a slate, and in order to wait for the next message, you washed out the message that was already there.
Why didn't they write on paper?
Well, they're jolly hard to hold in a stiff wind. The next round's about foreign phrases which are used in English books and sometimes, perhaps more rarely, in conversation. And I want to know what they mean. Dilys Powell, à outrance. A with a grave accent. O-U-T-R-A-N-C-E, à outrance.
Our front door.
It means 2 extremes, I think, doesn't it?
Yes, and you fight.
As far as you can do it.
Yes, you fight too.
Well, I think you're dead.
Yes, that's just what I wanted. You fight to the death. À outrance is to the death. Too much. Denis Norden, ballon d'essai. D''E''S-S-A-I. Ballon d'essai.
It's sort of try it on the dog. It's
Yes.
sort of an experiment. That's all.
That's good enough. It's a trial balloon, literally. Experiment to see whether the public will tolerate a new policy or another nation or state will tolerate what you're up to. You try it out. 2 marks. Nancy Spain, coup de main. C-O-U-P-D-E-M-A-I-N. Coup de main.
Blow with the hand or fist.
I suppose originally, yes,
A
Nancy.
sharp slap in the face. A punch-up.
You've missed out one ingredient, which is important, Nancy.
Garlic.
Well, I like garlic.
1.5. The point is, it's sudden. It's not only a vigorous attack, but a sudden, vigorous attack. Frank Muir, femme de chambre.
Oh, the wife of Mr. Chamber. And then they had words, and we put them into a dictionary. And it now means the chambermaid.
Chambermaid or lady's maid, it does. 2 marks. And now we come to the last round and go back to those quotations I gave the 2 teams earlier on in the programme. 2 marks, Nancy Spain. Can you give me the origin of your quotation? Are you sick or are you sullen?
Well, this is Johnson.
Yes, you're quite right.
Old Boswell, there, he'd gone into a decline. And Johnson wrote to him and he said, are you sick or are you sullen?
Well done,
Comma,
Nancy.
Boswell query.
Well done, Nancy.
Unquote.
Absolutely right. It's a letter to Boswell written by Dr. Johnson on the 3rd of November, 1784. 2 marks. Dilys Powell, the origin of your quotation, which was, it takes a great deal of history to produce a little literature.
Said by a very literary character.
Yes,
was it?
very.
Henry James.
Well done. Henry James's Life of Nathaniel Hawthorne, and that's what he said. 2 marks. And now I shall ask Denis and Frank to tell me their explanation of how these quotations came into being, and on this occasion the marks will go to whichever incredible explanation receives the longer amount of applause from the audience here in the theatre. So back to Denis Norden with his quotation, are you sick or are you sullen?
Well, we've been doing this programme for years now, and it's always announced as an incredible story, and I'd never really had a quotation that fitted something that really happened to me, but this did. My word of honour, this is absolutely true. I was in the RAF, and we were in Germany, and the war in Europe was over, and I was at that time attached to sort of an entertainment unit which produced shows for the troops for morale, and we were asked to do what is virtually a sort of command performance in Denmark. And I was in a group. In this group was a couple of people who have since become very well known on television. One is a chap called Bill Fraser, another one whose name I promised not to mention, but his wife's name is Mrs. Eric Sykes. And we went over the border into Denmark to do the show at a place called Aarhus, which isn't very far up. And we stopped there for a meal, for lunch. Now, you have to remember that this time there was rationing in England, and we went into the dining room and got served this incredible meal of things that we hadn't seen. And we ate practically silently. It was such an experience. And there was smoked salmon, and there was all kinds of marvellous fish and white bread and things like that. And it came to the end of the meal, and the chap came round with a sweet trolley, and we'd eaten so much, we'd made such pigs of ourselves, we didn't have any room for it. And Bill Fraser, who was in charge of us, said, no, we won't have anything else, thanks. And suddenly we spotted on the sweet trolley this silver tureen, which was full of cream. Now, cream during the war was the one thing you never saw. That disappeared practically when they bombed that rabbit at the beginning of the war. Cream went, you know. And there was this thick white cream. And he called the chap back and he said, wait a minute. He said, we'll just have the cream. And this fellow ladled out onto each plate a great mound of just cream, and it was a sight to see. We just couldn't for the moment bring ourselves to touch it. It was so strange. And Bill Fraser suddenly said, gentlemen, he said, this is not to eat. He said, it's for the grand gesture. He said, now I ask you to follow me. And he stood up, and we all stood up with him, and he put his hand under the plate, and he floshed it into his face, and we all did the same. And we sat down again. Now, there wasn't one word of comment from any of the Danes who must have thought it was a kind of strange English custom that you do at the end of the meal. And it was a very satisfying gesture, but nevertheless we didn't get any cream, you see. So we wiped our faces off and then asked the waiter to come back, and we had it, the whole thing again. He gave us all a plate of cream, which we ate. And we had to do the show that night, and we were as sick as dogs. I can't tell you how ill we all were. That was in Aarhus in 1945, and it was sort of my war story ever since, and I bored people with it, particularly my own family, who've had to listen to it about 50 times when everybody's present and they come round with the cream, and I say, I must tell you something that happened to me once. It was very trouble. And not very long ago, we were in Denmark, and I said, we must go to Aarhus and find this hotel. This time we traipsed all around the town. I couldn't find the hotel. It was raining. We went into another hotel and I ordered cream, and it was just as messy as you get over here. The whole thing was a kind of dream cream, and I finished up with everybody saying, you know, well, Daddy, well, where is it? I said, well, shut up, you know, and finished up very angry and fed up and disillusioned and sullen. And that is my memory of that town. And it's the first quotation that's ever fitted something that's really happened to me. As how I remember it is either Aarhus sick or Aarhus sullen.
And now we go back to Frank Muir, and if you remember, his quotation was, it takes a great deal of history to produce a little literature.
My story is a birthday present for my wife. At least it's to produce a birthday present for my wife. You see, what my wife, I know, would really like for her birthday is, belongs to a neighbour of ours. It's not a very valuable thing, but a very attractive thing. She likes it very much. It's a small, antique French milk jug. I don't think it's worth very much. So I went along to this chap and asked him if I could buy it. And he started talking about my word. And he, he said, do you make those stories up at the end? I don't believe it. I think you copy them. I said, no, we don't. And he said, tell you what, could you make up a story about anything? So I said, well, you either make it up or it's something that's happened to us. So he said, could you make up a story about an Eyre? So I said, yes, if you'll give me that antique French milk jug. So he said, all right. He said, next programme, if you'll tell a story for 5 minutes about an Eyre, you can have that. So this is what I've now got to try and do. But it's funny about Eyres because it isn't often that one gets a chance of telling a story that actually happened to one. And I can tonight because about 3 weeks ago something happened to my ear. My right ear started growing. It grew twice the size of the left one. It's a rather odd thing to happen, actually, almost bizarre. It was a Thursday that I noticed it. It was about midnight. I got up and and shaved. I think our bedroom clock gains a bit. I'm very well organised with my shaving, so there could be no possibility of mistake about this. I can see I have a light shrouded immediately in front of me, a sort of table lamp with a deep hood. And on the left-hand side, I have a little round mirror. On the right-hand side, I have a little round mirror. My face is then beautifully lit, and I can shave first the left hand, then the right hand. And while I was shaving, I suddenly noticed that my right ear was twice the size of the left. Now, this was a terrible shock. I really went into a kind of decline. It worried me because to try and take in quite the importance of what had happened, I suddenly realized how difficult this was going to make life. I don't at the moment wear spectacles. I'm young enough not to mind bumping into things. But there will come a day when I shall have to wear spectacles, and they will be biased. They will slope either from left to right or right to left. I could, of course, wear 2 monocles. But another thing is people started looking at me. They were staring at me in the street. I noticed them staring at me about the same time as I developed this technique of walking sideways. Left ear leading and right ear trailing, so that they wouldn't see it, you see. But they stared at me, they still stared at me. And the next morning, when I shaved, my ear had gone back to normal. Quite extraordinary, just like that. My ear was its normal size. Really was the most extraordinary, curious business. A couple of days afterwards, my wife was talking to me. She said, by the way, one thing I meant to tell you, did you know that those 2 mirrors, I didn't realise that they're those double mirrors, because I knocked one down and I must have put the right one back the wrong way. And the other side is a magnifying glass. But I've turned it round the right way now, you see. It's strange, I didn't pay much attention to it. But that's the story of my large ear. And I've won my bet, and I can now produce, if this man pays up, I can now produce the birthday present I wanted to give my wife, this small, antique French milk jug. It's very nice, actually. I've seen it. It's a sort of a biscuit-coloured jar. It is antique, and I know it's French, because it's got the French for dairy on it in rather speckly gold letters. Laiterie. I'm sorry the story is so long, but I had to keep it going for 5 minutes. It seems a rather intolerable time, but that's life, as Henry James once said. It takes a great deal of ear story to produce a little laiterie jar.
Well, by a very, very narrow margin, from your applause, Frank Muir wins the contest of stories, and that brings us to a final score in which Dilys Powell and Frank Muir win by 2 marks from Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, and this also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The programme was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC.